Should you sell your rental properties in the country where you live if you're moving overseas to go where you're treated best? That's the exact question I got posed from a viewer recently. Today I'm going to share my thoughts on whether moving overseas means selling your properties at home. Hi, I'm Andrew Henderson. I'm the author of the best-selling book Nomad Capitalist, available on Amazon, and the founder of Nomad Capitalist, where we help 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs and investors legally go where you're treated best. Here's the question from SR, who says, Andrew, do you recommend selling all U.S. properties when moving overseas? SR lives in the United States. I have a house in Los Angeles with high property taxes, but I could rent it out while I explore other countries. And so this brings up an interesting question. One of the issues that I didn't think about that someone left as a reply was good luck trying to find a tenant. It may or may not be more difficult. People say there's property management companies. I've done that in the US before. I've hired the property management company. Sometimes you have to have a manager to manage the property managers. And so that's a decision that you have to make. But what I would first look at is just the general tax perspective. If you own a home that you live in and you want to move overseas, the U.S. is a little bit different. In many other countries, you are generally going to need to rent it out, or you're going to want to sell it, or you're going to want to do something with it rather than just leaving it vacant, meaning that you have a house available to come back to. So every country has its own standards. If you're moving overseas to reduce your taxes, you're going to want to make sure you don't leave a vacant property be the scarlet letter on your tax plans. Now, that said, my first question to you would be, why are you leaving? Why do you want to leave the U.S.? Why are you leaving Los Angeles? And I think that can help you figure out what you want to do with the property. And so what I've seen with people from the U.S. and many other countries is they'll come to me and they own 6 different properties in their home country. So in this case, I think SR, he lives in the house, he's thinking of making it a rental property. Oftentimes the question is, people own numerous rental properties in their home country. What do I do with those? Should I keep them? What's the deal? Now, in many countries, this is not tax advice because it's impossible to cover every situation, but in many circumstances that I see across different countries, keeping a portfolio of rental properties isn't necessarily the end of the world. You could do that. But if you ask yourself, why am I leaving? People come to me and they say, I don't like the direction the country's going. Tax rates are going up. I don't trust the government. I don't trust private property rights. I mean, who knows? There's any number of concerns you could have. And what I'll sometimes hear is, I've heard this from people from Latin America, I don't trust the government to let me keep 6 properties. Okay, well, if that's your concern, then why would you want to keep 6 properties whether you live there or not? What I'll sometimes get is pushback of, oh yeah, I don't know, I kind of don't want to sell them. But if you ask yourself, why is it you're leaving? And the reasons you're leaving is limited freedoms, higher taxes, higher risks of owning assets in that country, then why would you keep the assets in that country that are going to potentially get you into trouble, could be taxed at higher rates? I mean, Greece, for example, you go back a number of years ago when they were really in bad shape and they increased property tax rates, I think it was like 8-fold. You couldn't give away a property in many cases. There were people who were going through long procedures to make sure they didn't inherit property because they just didn't want the bill. What am I going to do with this property? There's a glut of properties. I can't really sell it. Am I going to get anything for it? It's just going to be an albatross where I've got this big bill every year. And theoretically, who knows what a country could do to you? Oh, you don't pay your property taxes that just went up 8-fold? Hey, we're going to stick the bill to you personally. We're going to put you in jail. Who knows what they could do? And so I think that could happen in other places. I'm not saying it happens in Los Angeles, where SR is. I'm not saying it's going to happen where you live. But you want to ask yourself, what's your personal opinion? I can't tell you what you believe might happen. But if you're leaving, evaluate those reasons and see if the reasons for your physically leaving overlap with why you may not want to own those properties, whether it's your personal home, which again in many cases may need to be rented out anyway, or it's just a portfolio of rentals, okay? Now the next issue is the actual taxes. Now a lot of Americans I talk to, or people investing in the US, don't really pay that much in the way of taxes thanks to the depreciation. But ask yourself, what's the current, what's the future tax outlook? What am I going to pay to keep these properties? And so if the tax rate is higher than what you could pay on property somewhere else, then you'd probably want to sell the properties and just be done with it. Right? If the hassle of finding a tenant, if the hassle of managing a tenant, if collecting the money, the hassle of the laws in the jurisdiction, Los Angeles and California and the U.S. somewhat in general, but in this case it's more of a state and local issue. How do you get rid of a tenant? How do you evict a tenant? In my mind, if I'm moving and I'm opening up a blank slate, I'm going to look at a country where I have a lot more friendly landlord situation. I have some friends in Canada and in Montreal in particular who say, the way you have to evict someone can come in and live there for quite a long time before you can actually get them out. Meanwhile, you're losing money. You still have to pay the mortgage if you have a mortgage. And so what kind of a system is that, right? And then, the idea of, not paying much tax because of depreciation, doesn't really solve your problem. Plus, you look at, what's the future tax situation when you eventually want to sell the property? That might be much less favorable. And so if you put all that together, it may, again, for the reasons why you're leaving, be better to sell that property. The other question is, do you want to file a tax return? Now, for U.S. persons, you're always going to be filing a tax return, so not as much changes as for some citizens of other countries, to where you are going to still be filing a tax return, even if all your money is earned overseas, besides this rental property. So that's not the end of the world, just filing that tax return. However, if you're from another country where you are exiting the tax system yet while keeping your citizenship, the question is, do you want to go and potentially have to file a tax return? Again, every jurisdiction is different, but do you want to have to potentially file a tax return and deal with some kind of compliance reporting, whatever, to report just that rental property or properties when all of your other income moved overseas? It may be better off going and investing in a place where you don't have to file a tax return every year. And so I look at a jurisdiction just where I happen to be sitting in Georgia, where if Americans wouldn't benefit from the 5% residential rental income tax rate, but most everyone else would, you can come and pay 5% tax. You don't have to worry about depreciation or things being recaptured later. You don't have to worry about anything else. You have pretty good capital gains tax policy, theoretically zero. You can close on a property pretty cheaply. Now, management is perhaps an issue. I have a couple people that I work with that do property management, but they're not as common here. And you just get a very simplified tax regime. You have things like Airbnb that are actually encouraged by the government. There's just a lot fewer restrictions. In fact, it's so unrestrictive that the contracts just aren't even that rigid here because people generally just pay their bills. I've had other friends who are investors in other countries who said during the entire pandemic they lost $100, for example. Someone wanted to pay $100 less month. It just wasn't an issue, whereas you see landlords really having a difficult time in other countries. And so you want to look at the actual tax bill, you want to look at the future tax bill, you want to look at the complexity of filing a tax return. By the way, in Georgia, it's a pretty streamlined tax procedure, which is why I mentioned that. What you also want to look at in cases of countries like the United States is you are expatriating, if you're leaving the tax net for good, are there estate tax issues? Or do you need to restructure the ownership of that property, which again may make it not worth it? Now, I had a gentleman who came to me and he owned about $10 million in rental property in the U.S. He was not a U.S. person, but it was structured improperly to help him avoid U.S. estate tax at death. And so we had to restructure that for him. And so if you own $10 million in properties, doing a relatively simple restructure is not a big deal. He was glad to hear about it. If you own one property and it's worth $120,000 in Indiana, then you might not want to go through the process of restructuring in that case. And so that's another issue to consider. But by and large, my answer is you want to look at this holistically. There may be a situation where you say, I'm tired of paying high taxes on my business, but I still love the U.S. and I still think the real estate market there is great, and I've got a great property manager, and I don't think that the U.S. is falling apart. I just see the objective reality of I'm paying a lot of tax on my business. Well, in that case, I guess you have your answer. You feel comfortable with it. You can manage the risk. It's hard for me to give you the advice of exactly what you should do, but those are some things that you should think about. So my approach to this was I left the U.S. I rather soon thereafter sold my primary home. I didn't want that tie. I get rid of other ties to the U.S. I still kept a few basic ties. But to me, again, there was a reason for doing it. You have to make the decision whether you simply want to go for one particular element, i.e., hey, I've always wanted to live in Europe, and so I may not be going for tax savings, or the tax savings may not be that substantial, but I'm going to go and live in Europe and enjoy my lifestyle. That was actually the first thing that I wanted to do many, many, many years ago when my goal was to move out of the U.S. If you're just going for tax savings on your business, that's fine. So if you're going for a broader, holistic reason about concerns about the U.S. or whatever country it is that you're investing in with this real estate, then I would really, urge you to consider that perhaps the reason you're not selling the property or properties is a fear. I think as you're exploring the world, again, maybe it's better to sit on some cash for a while or put it in a REIT or do something. I'm not giving you investment advice, but maybe there's something you can do while you're exploring to be out of a bad situation, be out of a potentially bad situation while still earning some income and while you figure out what your next move is. I think the point of exploring the world, the point of what we talk about is there are other investment options out there where you could set up the same kind of thing, perhaps in a country that you could become familiar with, where there's higher returns, where there's a better tax regime. Those are all the things that I would think about when I'm considering selling my property where I'm leaving. Don't stop now. We've got well over 1,000 more videos here on YouTube for you to watch and learn how to go where you're treated best. And if you want to work with Nomad Capitalist personally, go to nomadcapitalist.com/apply, learn about our unique, tried and true process, garnered over years of experience, and learn how you can become our client.